Thank you everyone for joining, and many thanks to our panelists for joining as well. I would like to just open with a few housekeeping remarks. So today we're here to discuss the Appalachian Hydrogen Hub and carbon capture briefing. And before we begin, I just want to note, some of you noted this in the chat, but we are recording this session to share with individuals who are interested in this topic but unable to join us live. And if you would like a copy of this recording, please feel free to indicate that in the chat or let us know via email, and we'd be happy to send that along once it's prepared. In addition, we've enabled the live transcription for this event. So if you'd like to see closed captions as we proceed, please feel free to select the live transcript option at the bottom of your screen. The briefing will begin with a panel discussion, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. And to pose any questions, please use the Q&A function, and I will moderate those as they come in at the end of the panel discussion. So again, thank you all for joining, and I'm now very pleased to introduce our panel. Today, we're joined by Justin Mikulka, a research fellow at New Consensus. Prior to joining New Consensus in October of 2021, Justin reported for DSMOG, where he began in 2014. Justin has a degree in civil and environmental engineering from Cornell University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Justin. Kathy Hipple is a professor of finance with Bard College's MBA in Sustainability program. She is currently a research fellow at the Ohio River Valley Institute and a former financial analyst with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Thank you for joining, Kathy. Lee Collins is the managing editor and de facto hydrogen editor at London-based renewables and energy transition publication Recharge. When he's not editing Recharge's quarterly magazine, he's writing about hydrogen and producing a free weekly digital hydrogen newsletter. He joined Recharge in 2008 from the Daily Telegraph, having previously been an award-winning local newspaper editor, and has been writing about hydrogen since 2017. Thank you so much for joining us, Lee, especially from across an ocean. And Sean O'Leary, a native of Wheeling, West Virginia, and senior researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute, focused on energy and petrochemicals. Sean has written about coal, natural gas, and their role in the economies of Appalachia in a book, a newspaper column, and blog titled The State of My State. Previously, Sean served as communications director at the Northwest Energy Coalition in Seattle, Washington. I'm now happy to pass things over to Sean, who will share a brief overview before we get into our panel discussion. Sean?
Thank you, Joanne. And Alina, could you kick over to the first slide, please? One of the questions that frequently comes up, in fact, the very first question that I'm asked when the subject of the hydrogen hub comes up is, what is the hydrogen hub? And I've found that, for lots of people, the concept is a pretty vague one. So I'd like to at least provide a little baseline from which we'll work so that you'll understand what we're referring to when we're talking specifically about the hydrogen and carbon hub that has been proposed for the greater Ohio Valley, which includes Eastern Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, and the northern panhandle of West Virginia, and perhaps, depending on how you define the region, going all the way downriver to Eastern Kentucky as well. But the hydrogen hub is anchored by a piece of technology called carbon capture and sequestration. And what is being proposed is that a number of power plants, factories, and other facilities throughout the region that currently emit large volumes of carbon will have attached to them technology that will capture that carbon, and then that carbon will be carried by a network of pipelines that would be constructed throughout the region to various injection points where it would be injected for permanent underground storage. And so the process is that, as you know, this region is a very, very large producer of natural gas and coal. And so some of the natural gas and a little bit of the coal, mostly natural gas, is allocated for the use of creating hydrogen. And that process right now is one that emits a great many greenhouse gases. It's a large volume emitter. And so when we talk about equipping that process, which is called steam reforming, with carbon capture and sequestration technology, we're producing a product that is called blue hydrogen. And it's referred to as blue hydrogen specifically because the carbon capture technology will have theoretically, at least, removed the carbon emissions that would emanate from the production of that hydrogen. And when you listen to advocates of the proposed carbon hub, you'll often hear them refer to this as simply clean hydrogen. And they also present a pretty elaborate story about how this clean hydrogen can be used. In the most grandiose versions of their vision, they talk about a world in which we're driving in hydrogen-powered cars and in light trucks. We're heating our homes with hydrogen. Buildings are being heated with hydrogen. And there are a variety of manufacturing functions of things like cement and steel and fertilizer that are made with hydrogen, as well as heavy transport in the form of cargo ships and airplanes. And so in their world, the imagined outcome of this will be that the demand for consumption of hydrogen will probably be compounded by 10 to 20 times what it is currently. And so, as you can imagine, for the natural gas industry, which they expect will supply that hydrogen, that is a very, very promising new market, especially as we're coming to a point where the consumption of natural gas for heating and for electricity generation is largely leveling off, if not going into some degree of decline. But there is another part of this story, because unrelated to hydrogen, carbon capture technology also can be used, at least in theory, to capture the carbon emitted by coal and gas-fired power plants and other kinds of factories, including petrochemical plants. And so they too would be part of this general hydrogen and carbon hub. And in that case, we're talking about going into gas and coal-fired plants that already exist and retrofitting them with carbon capture technology so that they too would have pipelines literally coming up underneath the plants and carrying the captured carbon to injection points for underground storage. Alina, could you go to the next slide, please? Now, a number of people have asked, what this actually looks like for the Ohio Valley. What is the footprint that we're talking about? The image that you see right now is a map that I borrowed from a labor energy partnership publication called Building to Net Zero. And the Labor Energy Partnership, as you may know, is an alliance between former Department of Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz and his organization, the Energy Futures Initiative, and the AFL-CIO. And they've put out this publication in order to help people imagine what not only the hydrogen hub in the Ohio Valley would look like, but also other hydrogen hubs around the country. And so what you see in the little map, the little image to the right, are a series of little squiggly lines that look like worms. Those are presumed, or what they refer to as notional pipeline routes, where pipelines would run underneath the various power plants, factories, and any other facilities that emit carbon, capture that carbon and transmit it to the little yellow stars, which are the points at which it is presumed that the hydrogen or rather that the carbon would be injected underground. Now, there are, I should point out, there is no single fixed plan for what this hydrogen hub would look like. And in fact, there are many notions out there about just how extensive it would be. This is one of the relatively smaller ones because the folks at the Labor Energy Partnership, when they did this particular diagram, were anticipating that there would only be about 56 facilities that would actually be feeding carbon into the hub. And I think 29 of those were presumed to be gas and coal-fired power plants. There are other visions of the hub that have suggested that up to 150 or more facilities could be part of this. Of course, that would require a more extensive pipeline network to pull it off. But this gives you at least some kind of conceptual sense of both the geography of the hub and I think functionally how it would work. And Alina, could you go to the next slide, please? Now, there is, as you can imagine from our promotion of this particular seminar, we do see some potential challenges for this vision. I mentioned earlier that folks who are promoting the vision of the hydrogen hub oftentimes imagine a world in which hydrogen is being used in a variety of functions where it's not currently used now. I had mentioned, automobiles, light trucks, heating our homes, and many, many other things. The problem that exists is that from an economic standpoint, hydrogen, whether it's clean hydrogen or whether it's the gray or dirty hydrogen that we're using now, frankly, doesn't make economic sense for most of the functions that people are imagining. And so when we talk about things like heating our homes, doing hydrogen-powered automobiles, the fact is that there are electric technologies that are frankly far more efficient at doing those things. And so when we talk about the potential value of blue hydrogen, it is much smaller in application than most folks expect. In fact, a recent report from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory suggested that even in an expanded version, that blue hydrogen would only be, or not blue hydrogen, but hydrogen generally, would only expand in its use by about 2 times to maybe on the outside 4 times what it is now, which is a much, much smaller expansion than is suggested by many of its advocates. And then the second part of this, and I know Justin and Lee will be talking about this in more detail in a few minutes, there is another form of clean hydrogen, hydrogen that eliminates the emissions that are currently made in its manufacture, and that is, green hydrogen, which is made from water using a process that's powered by renewable energy sources like solar and wind power. That kind of hydrogen has both the potential to be sufficient in supply to meet all of the needs that hydrogen is likely to impose upon us going into the future. And more to the point, it can do it less expensively than blue hydrogen can. And then, though, for the Ohio Valley, there's another important consideration here. And that is that about 2/3 of all of the hydrogen, or rather, I'm sorry, all of the carbon emissions that are produced by industry in our region from fixed locations come from gas and coal-fired power generation. And there too, the notion of employing carbon capture poses some real economic challenges. A few months ago, the Ohio River Valley Institute put out a publication concerning the cost of carbon capture in those kinds of facilities and found that it would more than double the cost of electricity from those coal and gas-fired facilities. And as many of you know, coal already, even before you add in the cost of carbon capture, is rapidly falling out of favor because it cannot compete economically. And even gas-fired power plants are being pressured by lower cost renewable energy sources at this point. And so the concern is that when you look at the various functions for which hydrogen is not particularly economic in the first place, and you look at the fact that hydrogen, or at least carbon capture rather, is not particularly economic in the power generating sector, the actual amount of carbon that would be left to be captured from exercises or from industries in which hydrogen is applicable and in which carbon capture is affordable would be so small that they would not possibly justify the cost, the immense cost of building 1,000 miles of pipeline network throughout the region in order to provide the infrastructure that would be necessary for blue hydrogen. And so that, in a nutshell, is the challenge that we see the region facing, and that we particularly see this vision of blue hydrogen facing. And so we'll be expanding upon those points as we go forward with the discussion. Joanne, back to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. So for the first question, I'd like to direct the initial question to Justin, but other panelists should feel free to jump in if you have additional responses. So Justin, one of the terms that's often used in the discussion of these proposed hydrogen hubs is clean hydrogen. Could you explain what is meant by that term and how we can differentiate between clean hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and green hydrogen?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne, and thanks to inviting me today. I think this is a very timely discussion to really clarify some things about hydrogen. When we talk about clean hydrogen, what we're talking about is emissions made in production, because however we make our hydrogen, the end product is the same, and it's mostly a clean fuel. So we're talking about reducing emissions and how we produce it, and specifically we have to think about both carbon and methane emissions. Because methane is becoming, we have a methane situation that's methane levels are rising rapidly, and it's a major powerful greenhouse gas. So the reason we're talking about clean hydrogen is because the current hydrogen production is dirty. The majority of it is made from methane, which is the major component in natural gas. So right now the world the world hydrogen production, which is made from methane without carbon capture, contributes about 2% of global carbon dioxide emissions. So to put that in perspective, that's like the emissions from a country like Germany. So the existing hydrogen production on its own, we have to address if we're going to address emissions. But that's just carbon. And since most of it is made from methane, we have a real methane emissions issue to address as well. So knowing that we have the current production is obviously contributing largely to our climate issues. So we need to clean up even just that existing hydrogen production. So when we think about clean hydrogen, right now the only way to produce clean hydrogen is to, instead of using methane as a feedstock, is what is now being called green hydrogen. And so green hydrogen uses water as the feedstock, and then electricity to power something called an electrolyzer, which splits the water into hydrogen and oxygen. So if we're using clean electricity for that process, we've eliminated carbon emissions, and since there is no methane involved, there are no methane emissions. So there we have, clearly that is our option for clean hydrogen. Now when we're talking about blue hydrogen, it is made from methane. And blue hydrogen is essentially what would happen if we took the existing gray hydrogen production, the current global production, and used carbon capture and eliminated all methane emissions. And that would then be considered blue hydrogen. There are two real issues with actually achieving that in the real world. The first one is that we're dealing with methane and fugitive methane emissions. The methane that is released over the life cycle of production from when we frack it, put it in pipelines to the end use, methane is released throughout that process. A study done last year by Howarth and Jacobson estimated that for blue hydrogen, if methane emissions, fugitive methane emissions were 3.5%, then we would be better off simply burning natural gas or methane instead of using it to create blue hydrogen. That study was attacked by supporters of blue hydrogen and the natural gas industry, saying that in the real world, methane emissions were more like 1%, 3.5% was much too high. A study released yesterday that looking at methane emissions for the Permian region, which is the largest shale play currently in the U.S., a major producer of oil and natural gas. They concluded that the fugitive methane emissions for that field were 9.4%. So what we're looking at is it's not even close to the ballpark where we could consider blue hydrogen clean if we were sourcing it from a major shale play in the U.S. For when we're talking about these hydrogen hubs, that's something out of the control of the hydrogen hub. You have to get your supposedly clean methane somewhere to make hydrogen, to make blue hydrogen. So that's a real issue, and we've known about this for years. The oil and gas industry has said they were going to do something about it. We get more and more information about how methane is an increasing problem, and the study out of the Permian in New Mexico is alarming. So that's methane emissions. Now we just have to talk about carbon. And as I said, the existing hydrogen production contributes 2% of global carbon emissions, and what we're relying on, if we're going to use methane to make blue hydrogen, we need carbon capture to work and to capture at least 90%, ideally 95% of the carbon emissions in this process. I've written about this. A lot of people have looked at this. A lot of money has been spent trying to make carbon capture work for blue hydrogen facilities, for power plants. No one has come anywhere near 90%. Of capture rate, and most of these facilities, after they ran through the federal funding, shut down because it's just not economic, and you're not achieving the carbon capture that you should. So when we look at methane emissions and the fact that carbon capture has not worked, and that addressing all of these issues, whether it's having the producers of methane radically reduce how much methane they're emitting, or improving carbon capture, we're talking about really high costs as well. So it makes the economics of, even if blue hydrogen was technically possible, the economics look basically at this point very difficult to overcome.
Justin, I have a question. Are there any remaining power plants, coal or gas fired, in the US that are actually using carbon capture at this point?
I'm not aware of any. I know of several of the big projects. Certainly the big coal project was shut down. And so the project that I looked at more in detail was to produce blue hydrogen on the Gulf Coast. And they ran that for several years, and then they stopped that as well. And one of the main reasons is it's just not economic. So that's what we still haven't figured out how to do this. To actually technically achieve it, but to do it at a cost where it makes it, competitive.
Thanks very much, Justin. You were mentioning some of the challenging economics, and we have Kathy Hipple with us, who, Kathy, you have done a lot of work examining the business model and financial viability of the oil and gas industry. And I was hoping you could share with us what financial considerations of investing in regional hubs we should be thinking about in that context.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for putting together this panel, Sean and Joanne. One of the big issues is the concept of, does this make financial sense? And as Justin just pointed out, CCS itself has never been financially viable in the United States on any power plant ever. It was tried, as Justin mentioned, along the Gulf Coast. It was tried in Canada. It's been tried in the Southwest. Billions have been spent. It has never worked. So then you've got a question of wasted funds. The other big issue is the possibility of stranded assets. And when Sean mentioned perhaps 1,000 miles of pipeline, he may have been understating that by a big magnitude. There's not currently a pipeline infrastructure to transport compressed compressed carbon should it be captured and sequestered. So that would have to be built. And that's a huge expense, and it is likely to be stranded when we all realize that blue hydrogen simply is not economically viable. We've also seen the whole region depend heavily on fracking, and the promises made by the fracking industry have never been realized for the region itself. Individual companies for more than a decade had negative cash flow. This was quarter in, quarter out. Last year, with gas prices slightly rising, their cash flows improved, but they had a lot of hedging losses. So the fracking industry in general, the business case for fracking in particular has never been proved. In the United States, either in the Permian Basin, where they mostly frack for oil, or in the Appalachian area where they mostly frack for natural gas or methane. So there's a problem that the industry faces, and they naturally are behind the idea of keeping gas-fired and coal-fired power plants operating even when they're not economic compared to renewables. And one of the financial issues are, do you keep those power plants going when there are clear alternatives that are lower cost? So I think those are a few of the crucial issues of adding something as complicated as a hydrogen hub. It essentially is a way to keep the fracking industry going. And the fracking industry, as I think Orby has covered in numerous reports, has not delivered the benefits in terms of jobs, local taxes, local job creation that had been promised by the industry for over a decade.
Thank you. So Lee, you come to us with more of an international perspective. So I was wondering if you could share how the green and or blue hydrogen production markets are developing in Europe and the rest of the world.
Okay. Do you mind if I just comment on something Justin said?
Oh, absolutely.
I just want to put the unsort of cleanliness of blue hydrogen into perspective. Both Sean and Justin were talking about steam methane reforming. With steam methane reforming, you're not going to be able to capture no more than 90% of the CO2. You're going to have to actually get to the levels you need to meet the standards of clean hydrogen, the definition of clean hydrogen in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which says you have to emit 2 kilograms or less of carbon dioxide equivalent for every kilogram of hydrogen. You can't really do that with steam methane reforming. Even if you have zero methane emissions, you have to use something called autothermal reforming, which is a more expensive and less well-used process. I believe it's not actually being used commercially to produce hydrogen anywhere in the world right now. It's being used in a few cases to produce syngas, which is something slightly different. So only with autothermal reforming, ATR, can you hit the sort of 95% capture rates that you need. There was a study out last year or the beginning of this year, which said that even if you have zero methane emissions, to get to 2 kilograms or less of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen, you will need something like 95% capture rate. This study said that even a 93% capture rate would take you to 2.4 kilos. And if you don't hit the 2 kilo level, you're not going to get access to the billions of federal funding in the infrastructure bill. So yeah, you have to basically just say it's autothermal reforming, which is a much less well-used, not very commercialized technology. So it's even more difficult to prove that it can be done. So on your question about Europe, I mean, I've been writing about the global hydrogen industry for quite some time. To be honest, where things stand in the US, it's still kind of at the sort of level where it's just politicians trying to get federal investment, billions, and they're saying jobs, we'll get loads of jobs. There doesn't really seem to be the kind of cost benefit analysis and sort of sort of the realism that we're beginning to see in Europe, and only recently beginning to see in Europe. So, the understanding of the economics involved, the understanding of where and how the hydrogen should be used. I think we're a bit more advanced here in Europe. And the other thing I'd like to say about the rest of the world really is everyone outside the US is seeing hydrogen as a global market. So for both blue and green hydrogen. So you've got places like Europe, Germany in particular, Japan and Korea are all talking about importing a lot of green hydrogen. So you then have countries where that think they can produce green hydrogen really cheaply, trying to draw in investment. And I'll talk about blue hydrogen in a sec, but just on this green hydrogen, the more hours a day an electrolyzer is in operation, the cheaper the hydrogen produced. So if you have a lot of sun and a lot of wind, you can produce hydrogen a lot more cheaply than if you're just using solar power, and if you're just using wind power as well. So that's because the sun shines during the day, obviously, and the wind tends to blow stronger at night. So so you've got, and you also need a lot of land. If you're going to produce a lot of green hydrogen, you need a lot of open land. So the countries that are really sort of foremost in this are ones you wouldn't expect, and some of them have had nothing to do with the energy industry ever. So you've got places like Chile, Namibia, Oman, as well as places like Saudi Arabia and Australia. They've got these huge desert spaces. They've got the winds as well. So that's part of the, and some people are even talking about importing, Germany's even talking about importing hydrogen from the US, which is, you'd probably have to do it along the coasts. So, it's possible that if they got a hydrogen hub sort of on the Gulf of Mexico, it'd be cheaper to export than if it's sort of where you guys are in the Ohio River Valley. And it's a similar thing in the blue hydrogen sector. So you've got countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman again, and United Arab Emirates. They're all talking about exporting blue hydrogen to Europe. Just a few days ago, Germany signed a deal with the UAE to import blue hydrogen, more of a memorandum of understanding than an actual deal. So so it's in the sort of production side of things, it's seen as a global industry, much in the same way that oil and gas in some ways with LNG is as well. And then you've also got, I think things are a bit more advanced over here in terms of how the hydrogen should be used and discussions around that. I mean, even in the infrastructure bill, it talked about using hydrogen for heating, and almost no one over here takes that seriously. I mean, it's being pushed by gas distributors and a few sort of oil and gas companies, but it really doesn't make any sense. I mean, you look at if you're creating hydrogen from renewable energy, if you use that renewable energy directly in heat pumps, you get 6 times more heat basically than if you use a hydrogen boiler. So that doesn't make much sense. Hydrogen for cars is kind of, no one's really talking about it outside of Japan and Korea. Japan and Korea is slightly different because they don't think they can generate enough renewable energy themselves, so they'll have to do a lot of importing. So they're talking about importing a lot of hydrogen, but I don't think they've actually thought that through, because it just means that everything they do will be more expensive than elsewhere. But anyway, yeah, I could keep on talking. Any sort of specific things you'd like to ask?
I think that's very helpful. Just thinking about where the US is compared to some parts of the world that are a little further along in evaluating whether this makes sense in an effort to decarbonize, or whether there are other more viable and cost-effective methods, as a country like the US is taking decarbonization more seriously. So I think, the next question, and Lee, feel free to weigh in on this as well, but we'll start with Justin, which is getting into some more specifics about the current viability and availability of the technology that would be required to build the kind of infrastructure that is currently proposed for establishing regional hydrogen hubs in the United States.
I think that one of the main things that we have to consider here is that we're talking about building these hydrogen hubs and supporting more research on carbon capture because it doesn't work as we need it to work right now. So the availability of technology to make blue hydrogen, and this is something it's very common to hear people talk about blue hydrogen and say what it costs. Give a specific dollar, like this is how many dollars per kilogram. I find that hard to understand because no one is actually doing this on a successful commercial level. And the reason for that is the carbon capture technology doesn't deliver the results right now and is quite expensive. And when it comes to carbon capture, there isn't much I agree with Joe Manchin on, but in the end of last year, he said that he would love to have carbon capture, but it doesn't work. And even if it did, it's very expensive. And I think that sums up the current technological
changed his mind.
What?
He's changed his mind.
Oh, well, there was a brief moment of honesty.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that is an accurate depiction of where we're at. And so, but when we talk about green hydrogen, there isn't a lot of green hydrogen being produced right now, but the technology, the main thing that we need for green hydrogen, 80% of the cost is renewable energy. The other big cost is the electrolyzers. Those are Lee's at Recharge has done a lot of great reporting on this, but we were thinking, there was a study done by the Hydrogen Council, which is, they are big supporters of blue hydrogen. In early 2020, they said we would need 70 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity globally to make green hydrogen economically competitive. Right now, that number of, so in 2020, that was seen like, well, maybe that might be achievable. Right now, there are plans globally between 400 and 500 gigawatts by 2030. There's a project announced in Texas in the past month where they're talking about 60 gigawatts of renewable power to make 2.5 million tons of green hydrogen. This industry, the green hydrogen industry, is racing ahead. One reason is it's a simple technology. Electrolyzers have been around for a long time. They're making advancements. It's going to get cheaper, but the green hydrogen is technologically possible now. Blue hydrogen has remaining challenges, and the one that I mentioned early on, which a hydrogen hub can't do anything about, is methane emissions in the production fields. And those right now, the numbers that we're seeing make the idea of clean blue hydrogen impossible. So there are a lot of challenges and the costs of that pipeline network. That's one of the things about green hydrogen. You don't need that whole pipeline network to move around captured carbon because you're not producing any carbon to capture.
Yeah, I would just like to build on something that both Lee and Justin have pointed out, and that is that the notion of blue hydrogen, the use of carbon capture, is an add-on process. So we already produce hydrogen from methane. And when we talk about adding on carbon capture to that process, it means that we're inherently increasing the costs. And so blue hydrogen can never be at a similar cost level to gray hydrogen, which we're using right now. But to the point Justin just made, green hydrogen does have that potential. And that's because, as he pointed out, both the costs for renewable energy, both wind and solar, are coming down still. And also the cost of electrolyzer technology is rapidly plummeting as well. And so green hydrogen is not only cleaner for all the reasons both Lee and Justin have pointed out, but over the next decade or so, it also has a far, far more promising economic component to it. So I think on both grounds. Yeah.
could I just point out that because of the high gas prices in Europe right now, grey hydrogen is way more expensive than green hydrogen. So there was a study out last week by a Norwegian analyst called Rystad Energy. They're historically an oil and gas analyst. They said that the price of grey hydrogen right now is about $14 per kilogram compared to about $4 for green hydrogen.
Which points out another element of this, which is, of course, that green hydrogen is not susceptible to the vagaries of global commodity markets.
Sure.
As blue
you have a power purchase agreement, and you set the price for the lifetime of the project. So there are no ups and downs with, you know, if there's a war in Ukraine or somewhere else.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Sean, you touched on this a bit in your response just now, but could you address some of the additional potential ratepayer impacts or other cost considerations that we should be aware of as we discuss the hydrogen hub proposals?
Sure. And I'd also, I can see that Kathy Kowalski has submitted a couple of questions that I'd like to address also in responding to that. I, had mentioned earlier that there is a cost problem, particularly in the electricity market with respect to the use of carbon capture. And one of the questions that was asked was, is there enough money in the infrastructure bill that's already been passed by Congress to fund the creation of the carbon capture hub? And the answer is not even close. I mean, in the carbon capture, in the infrastructure bill, we're talking about, in round numbers, $8 billion that will be spent across 4 proposed hubs in various points in the United States. To put it in context, the White House Council on Environmental Quality reported that construction of the hubs, and I'm talking now just about the pipelines and the injection facilities necessary to capture the carbon. This doesn't count the actual carbon capture technology that would have to go on all of these plants all over the place. But the cost just for the pipelines and the injection technology would be between 170 and $230 billion. And that's not the biggest cost, because the bigger cost will be actually attaching carbon capture technology to all of these plants and factories. And that is probably most visible when we do talk about the electricity sector. And in a report that we did a couple of months ago, we found that the capital cost to retrofit a gas-fired or coal-fired power plant would cost somewhere between $1 billion and $2 billion per plant. Now, to put that in context, even constructing a 1,000 megawatt gas-fired power plant, right now the going cost of doing that is about $900 million. And so when we talk about retrofitting it at a cost of more than $1 billion with carbon capture equipment, we're talking about more than doubling the capital cost. And then on top of that, you have the problem that carbon capture reduces the operating efficiency of power plants that have to run it. And that's because the carbon capture technology itself has to be powered, and it consumes as much as 10 to 15% of all the output that the plant generates, which means that that's power that's not available for sale. And so when you take all of that into account, we're talking about in electric bills, seeing a situation where, as I said before, the cost of electricity from coal and gas-fired power plants would more than double. And if we were to retrofit all the current coal and gas-fired power plants in the US with carbon capture technology, we would be looking at a national bill of about $100 billion per year, indefinitely. And that's about a 25% increase on the entire $400 billion expenditure that we make annually for electricity, or at least did up until this year, which has been a little haywire. So yeah, the problem is that even if it were the case that carbon capture were successful in capturing anything close to 90% of all of these emissions, the price tag for implementing it would be overwhelming.
Thank you, Sean.
And I think that if I can just jump on what Sean said, I mean, one of the things that we always teach in a finance class is opportunity cost. Is that the best way to spend money when the region in general needs to really go from a laggard to potentially a leader in renewable energy? Is focusing on fixing essentially gas-fired power plants and coal-fired power plants and retrofitting them, is that the best use of the capital? Or is it looking forward and looking at the energy of the future? And I would maintain that the opportunity cost has to be figured in any kind of a cost-benefit analysis.
Well, and
I kind of said, the European perspective on this. The European Commission came out with hydrogen policy a couple of years ago now, which kind of gave equal weight to blue and green hydrogen. But in practical terms, the whole thing is totally skewed to green hydrogen over here. You've got to bear in mind that if you're spending billions on a blue hydrogen plant and carbon capture and carbon storage, indefinite carbon storage, it's going to be expensive. So over here, people are saying, oh, well, we use blue hydrogen as a stepping stone until green hydrogen becomes cheaper. But people are really beginning to realize that doesn't make any sense, because if you're spending these billions, that's a 30-year project that locks in the use of the fossil fuels for 30 years, because that's how long it's going to take people to make their money back. So over here, there's only maybe 3 sort of high quality blue hydrogen projects in the works, none of which have had a final investment decision. I guess with the price of gas prices here, they might not move forward with it, but then I guess they can kind of subsidize, if it's their own gas, they can kind of subsidize it, and they pay market prices for it. But obviously they'd make more money if they sold it. So yeah, so blue hydrogen here, Germany's just come out with, they just said that we don't really want anything to do with blue hydrogen yet. At the same time, they're talking about maybe importing it from the Middle East. So yeah, it's all a bit confused.
Yeah, and also going to something that Kathy pointed out about opportunity cost, one of the things that desperately needs to be pointed out here is that even if the federal government were to spend the $170 to $230 billion necessary to build the pipeline networks that we're talking about, the businesses that are supposed to be the customers of those pipelines, the users of those pipelines, still would have no incentive to do so, because they would still have to install and operate the carbon capture equipment, which would raise their operating costs, both their capital costs and their operating costs. And so if you're running a power plant, unless you know that even if you have a pipeline sitting underneath your plant, unless you know that your competitor is going to invest and incur the same cost as you are, you have no incentive to do it. And that raises a whole other problem, which is, yes, we can mount a national program, a federally funded program to build the hydrogen hubs, but how are we going to go about incenting power plants, factories, and any other facilities to actually use them? And to address that problem, right now in Congress, there are a number of bills, including Build Back Better in whatever form it ends up taking, that would provide massive subsidies to power plants and factories to install and use these facilities if they were built. But again, we're now talking, numbers that would, well, just in the electric sector, we're talking about, as I said before, $100 billion a year when we're all in for that, or $1 trillion over a decade. And that doesn't count all the steel mills, cement factories, fertilizer factories, and a variety of other facilities that would also themselves have to be outfitted and do this, which is why in the preliminary materials, I pointed out that if we were actually to implement this vision on a national scale, we would be looking at something comparable in cost to the Build Back Better bill that Senator Manchin rejected on the grounds that it was too costly. And also to Justin and Lee's point, and technologically, as in terms of its ability to actually mitigate emissions, it would do a pretty lousy job too.
Thank you, Sean. I'd like to go for a moment to another question posed by Kathy Ann Kowalski. And Justin, I'll direct this to you. Are you aware of any research comparing the viability and costs of green hydrogen versus battery storage?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things Sean has talked about early on about, there are people talking about we're going to have a hydrogen economy and everything's going to run on hydrogen. That's not going to happen for a lot of reasons. But there are some areas where we certainly have to address hydrogen and where it will be necessary to decarbonize the economy. As I mentioned earlier, one of the first, or the first most important thing to do is replace the existing dirty gray hydrogen that is contributing so many emissions. But then there is, certainly for the Ohio River Valley region, the best way to decarbonize steel at this point is using green hydrogen instead of coal in the steel production process. But then when it comes to storage, one of the things where green hydrogen is excellent at is because renewable energy, sometimes when the sun is really shining in certain areas or the wind is really blowing, there's excess energy. There's more than can be used. What's done now is that's curtailed. It's not captured in most places. Green hydrogen is a great way to capture that energy by using the electrolyzers and storing that excess electricity as hydrogen, which then can be run back through fuel cells to make electricity. So it is a good option for curtailing it, but one of the things when it comes specifically to batteries versus green hydrogen, there has been research that shows that batteries do a great job at 4 hours of storage and even up to 8 hours of storage. There was recently a competition, a bidding process in California about who can deliver the best long duration 8-hour storage. Lithium ion won. But when it comes to seasonal storage, storage of 100 hours or more, right now, really the best option is storing green hydrogen or storing hydrogen in salt caverns. So it's a very low cost way to store it, and you can store it for long periods of times. And there are projects. There's one in Utah right now. The big project in Texas has also suggested this. The U.S. is very lucky that we have a lot of salt formations, so there's plenty of opportunity. But from a standpoint of providing seasonal storage, right now, green hydrogen in salt caverns is a great way, is currently the leading option from everything I've seen for long duration energy storage. And I'll let Lee follow up.
I just want to also add some nuance to that, if I may. One thing to bear in mind about using hydrogen for basically electricity storage, power storage, is that it's really inefficient. You lose a lot of the energy by converting it to hydrogen and then back again. So I think the round-trip efficiency is something like 30%, 30. So you lose 70% of your energy by using hydrogen for storage. So for every 100 kilowatt hours you put into the hydrogen, you only get 30 out. So it's not really ideal. There are other sort of long duration storage, energy storage technologies out there. Liquid air is probably the most advanced that can equally store energy as long as you want. There's other technologies. There's compressed air. There's new battery technologies coming out. iron air, zinc air. So hydrogen is, I think we will need it, especially like if if you're trying to heat Europe, for instance, in winter using electricity, using heat pumps. You're not going to be able to do that without a lot of seasonal storage. But I think, to be honest, you're talking about, you need quite a high sort of renewable energy mix to make that worthwhile. So you're still 10, 20 years away before anyone's kind of really going to need that.
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with that, and that's the efficiency of turning electricity into hydrogen and then back to electricity it's certainly not ideal. But at current long duration energy storage options, it is from a cost standpoint one of the better ones. And as you mentioned, it's really for seasonal storage. But yes, there's compressed air. There are other technologies. From a short term,
you may be better off just sort of producing hydrogen and storing it rather than using power. So there's things like waste to hydrogen, which is a really good bet and probably cheaper than sort of the green hydrogen we were talking about. If you convert a lot of waste to hydrogen, store that, you could then use it in the winter. That's a really good option. And to be honest, hydrogen isn't really the cheapest type of long duration energy storage even now. I think liquid air is a lot cheaper. But again, I don't think it's something we need to worry about for at least another 15, 20 years.
Lee, while we have you on the screen, would you mind speaking just a little bit to, from a global perspective, where the demand for hydrogen is actually coming from?
Okay. All right. So when people talk about hydrogen these days, they talk about it in terms of energy vector, which could be used in transport, heating, energy storage, heavy industry. But first of all, you need to really think about this, because there's 70 to 75 million tons of grey hydrogen produced every year, and almost all of that is using the hydrogen as a chemical, not as an energy source. So to produce fertilizers, to produce other chemicals, and even in oil refining, it's used to remove sulfur from crude and stuff like that. So really, you should replace all that first, because as I think Justin mentioned earlier, the global hydrogen production produces as much CO2 as the UK and Indonesia combined. That's the stat of the stat that's normally used. So and then so heavy industry, apart from where hydrogen is used as a chemical, it's mainly used for high temperature heat. Steel is the exception, because it's used to remove oxygen from iron ore at the same time as providing the heat. So at the moment, there's no other commercial alternative to doing that green. Although, having said that, there are two electricity-only technologies being developed that would be a cheaper way of making green steel. One is called molten oxide electrolysis, which is being developed by a US startup called Boston Metal, which is backed by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is that billionaire venture fund with Bill Gates on it and Mark Zuckerberg and every other American billionaire you could think of. There's another one called electrowinning, which ArcelorMittal is looking into. But anyway, so a lot of people say, oh, we'll replace fossil fuel use in heavy industry with hydrogen. But to be honest, I think something like 95% of the high temperature heat required by industry could be produced just by electrical means. So microwaves, and other things like that. Even just convection heaters can kind of get to some of the high temperatures needed. So when people talk about, oh, we need hydrogen to decarbonize heavy industry, well, you don't really. You kind of need it for steel now, but that might not always be the case. Maybe for cement and concrete as well, but I'm no expert on those two. In terms of transport, well, let's talk about heating first. I mean, the use of hydrogen for heating is pretty much a complete nonsense. It's so incredibly inefficient. As I mentioned earlier, if you're using renewable energy to produce hydrogen versus using renewable energy for heat pumps, you get 6 times more heat. for your kilowatt hour than you do through hydrogen. Some people have begun talking about hybrid heat pumps, where you use hydrogen when it gets really cold and the heat pumps don't work very well. But the cost of having hydrogen going through our pipelines is going to be stupidly expensive. I mean, you've got to bear in mind that most gas pipelines will leak hydrogen, because hydrogen molecules are much smaller than methane molecules. So to pump hydrogen around in the natural gas networks is nuts. You're going to need 3 times more energy because it's a smaller molecule just to pump it around. You need to replace all the valves, a lot of the pipes, and you're going to have to do checks in everyone's homes to make sure it's not leaking, because it's explosive. Plus we don't want hydrogen leaking because it's an indirect greenhouse gas. So you don't want hydrogen leaking everywhere. So as far as I'm concerned, using hydrogen for heating is crazy. There's no reason to do it, apart from if you're a gas distributor and you're going to go out of business if you don't do it. In terms of energy storage, I kind of went through that. Transport's an interesting one. It's super inefficient to drive a hydrogen car. If you're using green hydrogen, that is, because I think you get 3 times more mileage for a battery car than you would on a hydrogen car. Slightly, the jury's out on sort of heavy vehicles, heavy trucks and things like that. Electric trucks could theoretically do the job, but then there's questions about how you would charge those trucks. The amount of electricity you would need would be immense. If you imagine you've got a truck filling station on a highway somewhere, and you've got 10 trucks trying to fast charge 1 megawatt battery at the same time, you can need a hell of a lot of electricity. You're going to have to massively upgrade the grids, and that might be a bit difficult. So the jury's out on that. Now, where there doesn't seem to be any alternative to using hydrogen is shipping and aviation. And when I talk about hydrogen, I mean including hydrogen derivatives. So you can produce the fossil fuels we use today using hydrogen, adding captured carbon dioxide. There's a process called the Fischer-Tropsch, which is kind of well established. You can do that, and you can also make methanol, and you can obviously produce ammonia just by adding nitrogen from the air. So in the shipping world, there's a lot of discussions about which sort of hydrogen derivative to use. You could theoretically use liquid hydrogen or compressed hydrogen. Compressed hydrogen, you don't get much energy by volume. Liquid, you get more, but you've got to store it at I think it's minus 253 degrees centigrade Celsius. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. It's very, very, very cold. So that's really difficult. And again, you don't get as much energy by volume as you do with ammonia or methanol. Ammonia still needs to be stored at minus 30 something Celsius, but that's a lot easier to do. Because otherwise it's a gas you want to transport as a liquid, so you get the most energy by volume. Methanol seems to be the sort of the favorite at the moment over here in Europe. There's a company called a Danish shipping company called Maersk, which is one of the biggest shipping container type companies in the world. They've recently invested in, I think it's 12 dual fuel ships, so that can burn methanol and the normal bunker oil. So they're kind of hedging their bets a little bit. But then, to be fair to them, they are also trying to produce their own green hydrogen to produce methanol. There is use captured CO2 to combine it with hydrogen. So that's really interesting. We recently had this first ever shipment of liquid hydrogen from Australia to Japan, which used incredibly dirty brown hydrogen from brown coal. but they just wanted to test it if it worked. Yeah, it worked, but it cost them $250 million, and liquid hydrogen is probably not the best way to transport hydrogen around the world. And in aviation, you've got Airbus talking about producing hydrogen planes, but because of the energy density by volume of hydrogen, it seems unlikely that you could ever use pure hydrogen for transatlantic flights and really long distance ones. You can maybe do sort of medium. So people are talking about using battery electric for short flights, hydrogen for medium length flights, and then for the real long range things, you'll have to use synthetic jet fuel. So you'd use the same engines that you've got now, but you would produce it from hydrogen and CO2. Of course, well, there is an option of using biofuels as well. We can kind of do the same thing through biomass. But you've got to bear in mind all these things are a lot more expensive than just using the existing fuels. The reason why people use bunker fuel for shipping and why they use kerosene for aviation is because it's the cheapest way of doing it. So yes, theoretically we can use hydrogen for these things, but costs are bound to be higher. You bear in mind the efficiency of, for instance, of producing, I've got a little chart here. So the efficiency of using renewable electricity to produce hydrogen to then produce something like kerosene, you're talking about an 87% loss of energy. So the amount of energy you get in compared to how much you get out, because you've got all these processes you have to go through. You have to go through electrolysis, then you've got the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, and then you've got the engine efficiency losses. It's bound to be a lot more expensive. So if we are going to have green flight in the years to come, it may be something that is a hell of a lot more expensive than it is today.
Thank you very much, Lee. We had a question come in from Reed Frazier, and Sean, I'd like to give you a chance to start with a response. So the question is, has anyone seen the formal hydrogen hub application submitted by any local companies or institutions?
I'm sorry, I don't unmute myself. I have not seen yet any formal applications, but the Department of Energy is in the process of going through responses to a request for information that it put out, for which submissions were due at the end of January. And pursuant to that and to processing the various responses to that RFI, they will be issuing, and I believe it's in May or June, a formal request for proposals in which companies, organizations, and others can make submission for federal funding for pilot projects in this area.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, there is also one other thing that I'd like to mention, going back to the economics of this, that I just want to make sure that we don't let go of. The thing that appeals to a lot of people, and especially a lot of regional policymakers, about the notion of a hydrogen hub is that it's theoretically a way to preserve, to not only help the oil and gas and coal industries, but I think most of the supporters would put it in terms of it will preserve and save a lot of jobs in those industries. And that is, again, a very, very problematic way to look at this, because frankly, there are not that many jobs associated with these industries to begin with in the region. We know the natural gas boom failed to stimulate significant job creation. And even if you look especially at the coal and natural gas industries as they currently exist in the region, and you even add into that the power generation industry, we're talking about somewhere on the order of, between Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, somewhere on the order of 30 to 40,000 jobs or workers, which sounds like a great deal. But the truth is, when we look at the costs of building these hubs running $100 billion a year, $1 trillion over a decade just for the electric sector, frankly, if you were to write a check for $1 million to every one of those coal miners, oil and gas workers, and power plant workers in the region, it would only cost about $40 billion, much less than it would to even build the pipelines necessary to do this. The point is, and then at the same time, going back to Justin's earlier point, there are less expensive ways to both meet our needs for products and services in these areas and to do it in a way that is actually eliminates emissions rather than partly mitigates them.
I think if your main goal is to make green jobs, to use this $1 billion of investment to produce green jobs, you'd be better off. There's 100 other ways you could do it that would be more cost effective. You know, putting solar panels on people's roofs, for instance, would create a hell of a lot more jobs than a big blue hydrogen hub.
Well, and there's a real risk in our region also, because there is money coming from Congress, from the federal government, to communities right now to do a variety of things. And one of the risks that we have that we've lived with before, when people were focused, for instance, on the natural gas boom, and when people were looking for the creation of a possible petrochemical cluster in Appalachia, we saw state legislatures and local officials divert lots of money into schemes to try to support or bring about those visions. And of course, those expenditures have largely been squandered and come to no good. And so by doing that, you're actually diverting both attention, but also actual funds, to your point, Lee, from activities that would be far more effective in doing things like bringing about economic development, in generating and stimulating the creation of jobs. And that's one of the biggest risks that we have. I mean, we may be talking for years, given that blue hydrogen technology isn't actually available yet on a workable level at scale. We may be we're talking about years and years down the road, in which we face the risk of seeing attention and resources diverted into the pursuit of a dream that frankly is never going to come about. And even if it did, it would not stimulate significant job growth, while ignoring other much more promising possibilities. And I would even add one final point to that. I've been emphasizing how expensive this venture is, the $170 to $230 billion to build out the pipeline networks, the $1 billion per facility to install the CCS equipment to run it, and then the millions and millions of dollars necessary to actually operate that equipment. What's interesting about that, though, is that just because you invest that much money does not mean you're going to get a big economic boost out of it. And for evidence, I would point to the natural gas boom. The natural gas industry in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania has already invested more than $200 billion in this region. And they managed to invest it without having a really measurable effect on jobs, which is quite remarkable, actually. And in other reports at Orvie, we've talked about the structural reasons why that investment, while it produced an immense amount of natural gas and an immense amount of GDP growth, did not produce significant growth in jobs and prosperity in the region, that there are structural reasons for that. And one of the problems with the vision of hydrogen hubs is that, at least in the case of Appalachia, the same structural problems that prevented that $200 billion investment by the natural gas industry from producing job growth and prosperity in the region are also, frankly, applicable to the hydrogen hub and to the various industries where that money would be invested as well. And so it's really frightening right now to contemplate that even as resources are becoming available to the region from the federal government and other sources, that if we allow the buzz, the rhetoric about the hydrogen hub to take control of our decision-making processes, much of that money and many of those resources will be diverted into the same kind of activity that failed to produce significant jobs and economic development with the natural gas boom. And that's the real risk we're facing now.
John, we have a few questions that have come in through the chat and the Q&A. The first is, why is the Ohio River Valley under consideration for this as opposed to Texas, where fracking has been going on much longer, or other places that might be suited to this kind of development?
I would say that the fracking has been going on for a long time in the Ohio River Valley, not necessarily so much less long than in the Permian Basin. It's been a different kind of fracking in terms of trying to produce natural gas as opposed to oil, but they've got a long history of that. And I think part of the reason there's so much political emphasis behind that is, although the industry has not produced the economic gains, they still have tremendous political power. And you only have to look at Joe Manchin to see how an industry, the coal industry, doesn't have economic power any longer in the United States, but one senator can have tremendous political power trying to prop up an industry that by all rights from an economic standpoint should be on, is on the decline from a financial standpoint. So I think that Sean's point is that this is, in a sense, a boondoggle, the title of his report. We haven't used that word in this webinar, but it's really a boondoggle to shore up an industry that on its own is facing financial difficulties. One other point, just to bring this up again, is the volatility of oil and gas prices. So that you see this more in Europe and where Lee is, but it really, it affects everything in terms of long-term planning. And the beauty of green, truly green hydrogen and renewables are that you have visibility for decades in a way that you never will with any fossil fuel-based projects.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah,
go ahead, Sean.
The other point that I would make, I mean, one of the reasons for looking at the Ohio Valley, as Kathy alluded to, is the fact that, this region produces more than a third of all of the natural gas produced in the United States right now. So there's an immense amount of methane available, at least theoretically, for the production of hydrogen. But I did want to point out that the federal government is supporting or promoting the development of 4 hydrogen hubs around the country, of which this is just one. They are also promoting them along the Gulf Coast and in the Mountain West as well. And one of those is supposed to be a green hydrogen hub, which would be out in Utah, I believe.
Thanks, Sean. Another question came in regarding a proposal for a study at the Davis-Besse facility in Ohio. So federal funding that has been directed towards studies to make hydrogen at nuclear power plants like Davis-Besse, excuse me. Is anyone familiar with these proposals and interested in commenting?
Next. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, that's something we haven't discussed here. Another form of clean hydrogen, which has been branded pink hydrogen, is using nuclear energy to power electrolyzers to make hydrogen, and that is the focus. As Sean mentioned, there are 4 proposed hubs in the U.S. Two have been designated for areas that have cheap shale gas, which is why Sean was saying why the Ohio River Valley is being considered. One is for green hydrogen, and then one is supposed to be using, showing how nuclear power can be used to produce clean hydrogen. There are some advantages for nuclear power with using, it's a different type of electrolyzer, but they can use the excess heat from the nuclear process, which is a way to make it more efficient. The problem that the nuclear industry faces is I'm not aware of anyone proposing building a new nuclear power plant to produce hydrogen, because nuclear power is expensive. Renewable power, the reason why green hydrogen is getting a lot of traction right now is because, especially in places like Chile, is renewable power is so cheap, and nuclear power just can't compete with that. Technologically, if you take the economics away, creating hydrogen from nuclear power using these different types of electrolyzers, it seems very achievable and promising. Again, we get back to the economics. Does it make sense? I've seen nothing where it could be able to compete with renewable energy.
Yeah, I would totally agree with everything Justin said. The only thing I would add is it may be more expensive to produce pink hydrogen, but it would also be easier to produce at volume if you have the nuclear power plant. So even if it is more expensive, it might be useful just because of the sheer volume that it could churn out, because not only are electrolyzers more efficient and they're being used around the clock, and therefore that brings down the levelized cost of hydrogen, but also it uses these solid oxide electrolyzers, which Justin was referring to, which use the heat as well to make it even more efficient than the normal alkaline or PEM electrolyzers. So there is an argument, but again, if your purpose is to sort of help the planet, you would use the nuclear power just for electricity, rather than sort of wasting 40% of the energy by converting it to hydrogen and then transporting the hydrogen.
Thank you. Another question that we have is also fairly technical, and this question is regarding leakage in storage of hydrogen and immense cold temperatures in storage. So how do these factors affect salt cave storage below the Ohio River, and regarding leakage to local communities and potential environmental effects like river temperatures or impacts to wildlife or transportation that goes along with that,
if that's okay.
Yep.
The storage of hydrogen in salt caverns is as compressed hydrogen, so it's not liquid hydrogen. Liquid hydrogen has to be frozen effectively at well, not frozen, it's the boiling point. It has to become a liquid at minus 253 degrees Celsius. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about storage caverns. That's compressed, and the idea that these caverns can leak is unlikely. They're about as likely as stored CO2 to leak. You imagine you spend all these billions storing CO2 to produce your blue hydrogen, and then all the CO2 leaks into the atmosphere. No, there is a risk that an earthquake or something could disturb the cavern and create a crack that allows it to leak. But you'd be pretty stupid to build one of these things and use it in an earthquake zone. So I don't think there's that much risk of these things leaking. And even if they did, it's not like methane where it'll or ammonia, for instance, where it could harm local people. Hydrogen goes into the atmosphere pretty quickly, just goes straight up. There would be a slight risk of explosions, but I think we're talking about very, very, very small risks, so I wouldn't worry about that.
And just to follow up on that, there are three salt caverns in the U.S. right now, two, I believe, in the Permian region, where they've been storing hydrogen for decades. So this isn't, and a lot of the natural gas right now in this country in storage is also stored in salt caverns, as is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that holds crude oil. So I agree with Lee that the way these are designed, it's a very safe way. Obviously, we're talking about there can always be risks, but as Lee mentioned, the idea of it affecting the temperature of any local water bodies or anything, that's just not going to happen.
Thank you. So we are coming up on the end of our planned session today, and I would like to Oh, I see we have one additional question that came in, which is a request to define what sources can produce green hydrogen, and a reference to Colorado's redefined sources that can produce green hydrogen. So Justin, I know you touched on this in the first question that was directed to you, but if you wouldn't mind just summarizing based on definitions of green hydrogen.
Yeah, I think something it's important to green hydrogen. Pretty much it's accepted that what we're talking about is using renewable energy to make hydrogen by splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. And so, but it's one of the issues we face with this. All of these different brandings by different groups, pink, green, they're various things. It's important to remember what we're talking about here. Is it clean? Are there methane emissions? Are there carbon emissions? So you can call it whatever you want, but when we get down to the science of it, what we're looking at doing, the whole reason we're having these conversations is we pretty much all of us agree that we need to reduce both carbon and methane emissions, and we need to do it quickly. So I have not seen what Colorado has done. I know Colorado is a very oil and gas friendly state, so I wouldn't be surprised if they're trying to redefine it. But what we're going to get down to, is how much carbon and how much methane is produced if you're making it from methane or coal. But as far as redefining green hydrogen, I think globally it's pretty well accepted that we're talking renewable energy powering electrolyzers using water as a feedstock.
Can I just add to that? I would define green hydrogen as anything which produces hydrogen with zero emissions, and there are two other ways of doing that. One is through waste, which would either, for instance, go into landfill with the landfill, and decompose with methane going into the air. There's lots of companies now doing waste to hydrogen, especially in America, actually in California, especially. And you could also produce hydrogen from biomass or even biogas, which again is not the generally understood term of green hydrogen, but people doing it call it green hydrogen, and there is no specific color for waste to hydrogen or biogas hydrogen, so it's kind of green in my book.
Thank you. So as we close out the program, I'm hoping, Sean, if I could just pass things over to you to give a couple of closing remarks and kind of set the stage for where we are in the process. So the infrastructure bill has passed, DOE has accepted responses to its request for information. There are various alliances that are forming, like the MOU that's been signed between US Steel and Equinor. So what are we likely to see in the next coming months, and what should we be paying attention to as we continue to track this issue?
Well, given that because of all the economic factors that we've talked about here, virtually the entire game turns on what the federal government does, because the private sector, frankly, is not going to pony up a dime to do this, at least in the Ohio Valley. There is a somewhat different situation along the Gulf Coast where captured carbon, for instance, can be used in enhanced oil extraction. And so they have a somewhat different set of economics there. On the federal front, there are really two things that are going forward. The first one is what you just alluded to, Joanne, which is the request for information from the Department of Energy, which is going to be transformed in the next few months into a specific request for proposals, in which individual companies and organizations who have, whether it's power plants or steel mills or fertilizer plants, can submit proposals to the federal government for seed funding in order to implement, in this case, it would be carbon capture. Now, so that's what's going to unfold locally. And we're also seeing some evidence of state governments beginning to create programs and efforts to facilitate this. One measure that is being pursued in a number of states with encouragement from the federal government is that the permitting and regulation of the caverns that would be required, the storage facilities that would be required for carbon, that permitting and regulatory primacy be shifted from the Environmental Protection Agency to the relevant state agencies. And the reason they're pursuing this measure is because it's expected that the permitting process will be much faster and less expensive at the state level than it is at the federal level. So that's the other area where you're likely to see, and where we are already seeing, in fact, steps being taken to bring this about. I think the third, so, those are things that will work toward getting carbon capture implemented in some plants here and there. And then there are measures being taken to pursue permitting. As far as the actual construction of the pipeline networks and injection points that would be required to do this, that is pretty far down the road at this point, because frankly, no one is going to pay for it other than conceivably the federal government. And that would take a whole other major piece of legislation in order to bring that about. It has been suggested by the Labor Energy Partnership in its documents that such a thing could be done on the same model as was used to create the Bonneville Power Administration in the Northwest, where the federal government actually builds and owns and operates the facility, and that the costs for it are recovered from the facility's customers. But again, that would have to be also a very major piece of legislation to bring something like that about.
Great. Well, I know we are at time, and I'd like to extend another thanks to our panelists. Thank you very much for joining and sharing your expertise with us today. And also thanks to all of the attendees who joined us this morning. If we did not get to your questions, or if you have additional questions that come up, feel free to reach out to us. I'm going to put our email address in the chat. And we will be able to field your responses and make sure that we help address any remaining issues. So again, this is a major topic, and I'm sure it's the first of many times that we'll be discussing it. And it's been really wonderful to have our panel here to share their perspectives.